to talk about framing your messages and how to really engage people, because whether you're talking to the legislature or whether you're talking to the media, you need to get people engaged in your issues. And that all begins with messaging. Most of the time, people want to begin with all the tactics. So everybody starts off and says, well, we gotta engage the media, you know, and everybody, oh, okay, let's write a press release. Well, what's going to go in that? And how is that part of a larger strategy? So we're going to talk about some of those things. We're going to talk about why messaging is so important, what makes for strong messages, understanding who you're talking to, and what they need and where they're coming from. And then we're going to, hopefully if we have enough time, we'll do an interactive exercise so that you can put some of what I'm talking about this morning into action. So I don't know if you're familiar with the social media site Mashable, but I love this quote, Pete Cashmore: "Content is not a scarce resource, getting attention is." And you know, there's so much going on in the world. We're just bombarded every day with messages. This doesn't even begin to cover Libya, the earthquake in Japan. I mean, if you were trying to communicate this week about your issues, good luck. Because really, you just can't, even though your issues are local issues, it's very hard to get above the noise. And then in a lot of places, you have reporters that would normally be covering, your issues, and they may be taking the "Are there people from our area in Japan right now?" story. So it's, you really have to look at what you're trying to do in the context of what else is going on in the world. And I want to give you guys, to begin, a little quiz. This is not that hard. Here we go. Night, rest, slumber, tranquil, NyQuil, bed, snore, pillow, soft, quiet, sullen, awake. You may now write. So, how many of you remembered the word night? Okay, why? First thing, and people are most attentive right at the beginning of when you're starting to make your case. How many remembered the word NyQuil? Okay, why? It's a brand, and a brand, by definition, is something that's branded into your brain. How many had bed and snore? Okay, bed and snore were numbers 6 and 7, right smack in the middle of the list. So what does that tell us? That people don't remember the middle, right? I mean, so that you can get lost unless you're really good storyteller and you're really, using the techniques to keep people alert. How many people had the word sleep on the list? Okay, I'm so happy. Sleep wasn't on the list, okay? Now, and you know what? I'm happy because I did the same thing the first time I took this quiz. But what does that tell you? What does that tell you? It tells you that when you can't quite understand or remember, your brain will make the associations it needs to based on what you're saying. So nature abhors a vacuum. Your brain, fills in where it doesn't have the answers. And last, how many remember the word awake? Okay, and that was last. So it's a good exercise just to illustrate, how we absorb what we're hearing. Not everybody's, responds to things the same way, but these are generally good points of view, so that when you're making a presentation or you're talking to a legislature and you've only got, or a reporter and you've only got a few minutes, you want to make that opener really good, and you want to make the end, the kicker, really strong, and not get bogged down in the middle. So too many organizations communicate like this: I have something I'm going to tell you, and I'm just going to tell you because it's important to me, and therefore it should be important to you. So there's this big megaphone that people are saying, and they're not effective because they're not connecting with where the audience is. And if I leave you with anything today, it is that to understand who's the recipient and what matters to them and where they're coming from. So the way you see things is the way you see things. So what do you think is going on in this picture? Now take a look at the next picture. That is that picture on television, and this guy is somewhere in the Southwest. So when you first see that picture, you think, we're in the city, you know, this is what's going on, but in reality, we're somewhere else. In other words, what you think, the way that's that one frame. Just took a picture of the TV set, and you could conclude many things about what was happening and where you were. When you see the context, that this is somebody watching this on television, in other words, people are coming to this through looking out their own window, and their window, the view out of their window may be different than the view out of your window. And this is where we get into framing. And there's a really great book that I would recommend to everyone to read. It's called Don't Think of an Elephant by George Lakoff. George Lakoff is a linguist, and he writes a lot about framing and framing messages. And I'm going to read this quote because I think it's so important. Framings are mental structures that shape the way we think. As a result, they shape the goals we seek, the places we make, the way we act, and what counts as good or bad outcomes of our actions. In politics, frames shape our social policies and the institutions we form to carry out our policies. To change our frames is to change all of this. Reframing is social change. So it's really important, this concept of framing messages and understanding the larger conversation that you're trying to enter into with your issues. So when you're thinking about framing messages, you want to try to understand what are the common beliefs, understandings, and values that people hold about your issues. And by the way, you're going to get a handout with these slides as well as a primer on media relations that you'll have at the end. So if you're all trying to figure out to take notes, don't worry about it, because it's all here. What is the current conversation about this issue, and who's shaping that discussion, and how is it playing out? It's really important that you or people on your teams or in your coalitions are reading the papers, reading what's going on in social media, not just about your specific issue, but the context. If you're talking about IDAs, or you're talking about different kind of wealth building strategies, you also want to be looking at other things other discussions that may be happening related to the communities that you're trying to serve, relating to issues in the legislation, what other things are on the agenda, and where your issues may fit. How do the frames that people have affect policy? So if one of the things that George Lakoff talks about in his book is the whole discussion about tax relief during the, I guess it was the 2000 election. And the Republicans framed that beautifully, calling it tax relief, that somehow there was something wrong that we needed relief from. And it was a very simple message. It was easy to remember. And so anybody who was opposed to tax relief, was inflicting pain, right? And what Lakoff was arguing was saying, well, the progressives, Democrats could have reframed it by saying, paying your taxes is patriotic, right? Being in the United States is being like in a club where you support the club, and it's patriotic to support the issues, and here are the things that taxes can do. But instead, the issue was framed as tax relief. It's stuck, and so even when the Democrats were making their arguments, they were arguing using the Republican frame. Either they were trying to go against it, instead of reframing the issue and getting people to see the tax issue from a different perspective. The other thing to think about is as you're thinking about reframing in conversations, how can the conversation be reframed to reflect broader choices than are being presented? Under the tax relief frame, the solution is don't raise taxes. That's it. Whereas if you're reframing it as taxes are patriotic, then it exposes you to a different set of choices, different set of decisions that could be made. So here's an example of, this is just a very concrete, we have a local power company here that's in a lot of trouble. And power is not reliable, and there's been a lot of issues that they haven't been maintaining the infrastructure. And I just saw this in the Post last week, and there was a report that came out, and the frame was, and this was the headline that played out for 2 days, was that there was a consultant's report, and they said, Pepco's come up with this report for what they're going to do about the power problem, and it was just cobbled together, right? So Pepco acknowledged it does not know whether the projects in the new plan will actually achieve its reliability goals because it did not fully analyze, and the report said, with this ready, shoot, aim approach, a portion of the company's plan capital is almost certainly poorly targeted. So then the Pepco response is, he repeats the negative frame. We don't feel like it's something that was just cobbled together, right? We're spending millions of dollars to additional money to trim the trees. So they've got an uphill battle, because I was one of those people that didn't have power for a week, and my power goes off all the time. We have a wind blow and it goes out. But I was talking to somebody at Pepco yesterday who said, well, we're doing all these things, but nobody hears it. Well, nobody hears it because if you're not, people don't want to hear it right now because we're angry, right? We don't want to hear it because, but on the other hand, if they keep repeating the negative frame, it's going to be very hard for people to hear it. Instead of talking about, we know we have issues and we're moving forward to do leading with a sentence like that, you start saying that enough over a longer period of time and it begins to stick. So so I'm telling you these very sort of lofty ideas about framing. Well, what do you do? How do you do this? Well, first thing is that you should look at your resources and look inside at your organization, your coalition. What resources do you have and what capacity do you have? Who do you have that can be looking at reading the papers, or if you're all reading the papers, are you doing it in a thoughtful way and sort of really taking note about what those conversations are? How can you use the resources you have to begin to do some of this research? And then you need to sort of take stock. Well, what's your reputation? How do people perceive you and your work? How aware are they of what you're doing, right? Because you have to understand where you're starting. And then what's your style? Are you academics or are you street fighters? Real strong advocates? Because there's different style, and there's not one that's right or wrong. You just have to understand where you're coming from, and then work with that. And then again in external, so you ask it internally, well, what do we think our reputation is, right? Externally, you want to start asking people, as you're talking to different people, you don't say, hey, what's my reputation? But sort of, well, what do you think of our work? What are we doing well? What's been working? Ask your stakeholders, ask your funders, ask people how they perceive what you're doing. Just take a pulse. And you can do that in a very formal way, or you can do it just every time you're interacting with people. Ask them, how well do they understand your issues? Or what do they think of your issues? Or, just to try and kind of do some basic understanding of how people understand you and perceive you. Timing issues. What else is going on in your community that's competing with, or maybe complementary to some of the things that you're doing? Who else is working on what you do? or in related areas? Who are your allies? Who are your opponents? And what are their resources? And then, again, how has your issue been portrayed in the media and increasingly social media as well? I just believe in Google News. It is such a powerful way to find out what's being written about you, what's being said about you. It's not perfect, but it's a very simple way to do that. And you really want to look at all sides. People tend to often look at who's with them, but you really want to look at, who's not with you and where they're coming from. So, important thing is targeting your audiences. And again, you're going to see a lot of repetition here because this is something I really want to get across. Who do you need to reach and why? What's their stake in your issue? What's the benefit to them? Supporter, detractor? Are they a connector, influencer? Are they neutral? Are they somebody who's movable? Maybe they're not exactly where you are, but could they be moved? How do they get information? How are they becoming informed about your issues? What do they read? What do they watch? I always ask people, how do you know what you know? What TV shows do you watch? I mean, a lot of people get their news, as we know, from Jon Stewart and Jay Leno. It may not be what you think. And increasingly, because of the way social media is and even the way that the traditional media are packaging themselves online, people are going to the information from other people like they are or who share the same opinion. So it's really important to go look at those, Glenn Beck and Hannity and all those folks, because they're engaging the discussion, and many of the legislators, people that you're trying to engage, are watching and that. So you have to understand where they're coming from. And again, what are the things that influence them? And you want to sort of identify your audiences. Who are the primary ones? Who do you absolutely have to have with you to be successful? And then who are the secondary audiences that actually influence the primary audiences? Many people will say to me, the media is my audience. And the media really isn't your audience. They are a conduit to the people that you want to reach. And understanding exactly who you want to reach affects which media you actually target and which reporters you target. Okay, so this is repetition. These are some questions to ask. I'm going to give you a specific example. Once you've asked, make a grid and really take the time. And I'm a big believer in writing these things down. People say we sit in a meeting and we go, oh, our audience is legislators. What legislators? Who's on what committee? You really want to drill down as specifically as possible so that you have a face in mind when you're crafting your messages. What matters to them? Is this guy up for re-election? Did they just come from a very bruising re-election battle? Are they vulnerable on certain aspects? You really want to almost make really go through this and write it down and make a grid, because that will help you in framing. What are your common values? What are the barriers? What prevents people from hearing or understanding what you're trying to get at? And more importantly, what is it that you want them to do? So if they hear your message, what action do you want them to take? And if they take that action, how is the world different? And being able to articulate that. And then what you want to do is sort of match your different audiences to what the outcome is that you want to achieve. We want them to increase their giving, donors, board. We want them to raise money. We want them to make introductions. Political leaders, introduce support legislation. This is just an example, say, of homelessness. So when you're thinking about framing, And this is another resource that I would take a look at is the Frameworks Institute. It's a nonprofit here. They only work with nonprofits. They have some really great tutorials and articles, a lot of really good resources there, and it's all free. And this comes straight from them. So you want to lead with values. You know, research shows that people reason on deeply held moral values. So, you know, notion of there's a American notion of fairness, what's fair and right. You know, metaphors, and we're going to see an example later with a case study that I pulled out, where they talk, instead of saying, you know, support the police, they say support the heroes who keep our streets safe, right? That paints a picture. Hero, we all have positive associations with heroes. So you want to use metaphor when you're talking about, and we're going to work on some of that. Messenger. You know, it's not just what you say, but who says it. Is that person credible? Does that person have influence? Is the person a good storyteller? So, you know, if you're going against, you know, some legislators or trying to engage some legislators, and you walk in with a very dry academic presentation with lots of facts, that may not, it might be the right messages, but it may not engage, you know, a very colorful legislator who he or herself wants to make headlines. So you got to think about that. Tone, you know, matching the style of how you deliver the message to the people who are receiving it. Visuals. You know, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and that's absolutely true. Wherever possible, you know, you don't want to present slides that are so dense and have, you know, 9-point type and lots of facts and figures. You're just gonna lose people. And I'm very glad that we have the lights on here, because I never like to do PowerPoint in the dark. That's another thing. You never want to do that. Solutions. What can we do? And that, I think, is really important, because what happens is people come in and they present a vision of the world. We need to transform the world. We need to change the way we do things. That's so big. That is so big and so, you know, people just throw up their hands. I don't know how to change the world. I hear a lot of nonprofits that I work with, they talk about we're transforming. And I say, transforming, that's huge, you know? But let's talk about, you know, we're not going to transform. We're not going to get from 0 to 60. I mean, we want to get over here, but what are the steps along the way that we could actually achieve? How, you know, what are the ways that we're moving towards this transformation? It's very unusual to transform in 6 months. But you know, I mean, but people come in, you know, and it's good to have that big, bold goal and big, bold vision. But if it's so big, it's just so overwhelming to people. Context, again, what else is going on? You're not the only thing. You know, when I was a reporter, I would get, well, this is the old days, you know, faxes and phone calls, you know, from hundreds of people. And, you know, and they all were important. And the ones that, you know, I would focus on were the ones that, A, were relevant to the beat that I was covering. You know, I didn't want to talk about animal crackers when I was covering the police beat. And, you know, I would say, why are you calling me? You don't read anything I do. Why, you know, I don't get to do fun stories about animal crackers, you know. So you really have to be aware of what else is going on and in the world, and what else the recipient is juggling in terms of messaging. I think if you use this is a good template for how to start framing your messages. First think, well, who are you? Right? Who is your organization? This is where you talk about, this is what we do. We are an organization that is dedicated to whatever. Now, when you talk about that, you want to talk about your mission and what you do, but you also want to make sure that you're talking about why what you do matters. So you really want to lead with something that allows you to engage people, something that's a little provocative. Okay, so what's the burning problem you want to solve? All right, so you're here, you're doing this. What's the problem? What's the unique opportunity that we have today with you? Another way to look at that could be the urgency. You know, why do we need to react to this now? What's the solution? Okay, so what? So what that this happens? And then what do you want me to do? What can I do? How can I be a part of that? How do you engage me? So one of the tools that I like to use when we are doing messaging is I like to use this geometric figure. Some people have a message box, some people have a quadrangle. I like triangles. I like threes because it's much easier to do. And you can do this around a specific issue. But what you want to do in the middle is come up with the core. You know, what's the basic fundamental thing that we're trying to get across? Very simply, like the architect, we create places that people love. For MAD, it's, what did I did that. A safer future by eliminating drunk driving. Okay, that's really where that's where they're trying to go. We're trying to make the world safer, a little bit safer by eliminating drunk driving. A message is not a soundbite. A soundbite is a way to convey a message. Okay? They have to be repeated because people, there are studies that I think you have to hear something 7 or 8 times before it begins to stick. And stories can help drive your message home and put a human face on the issue, but you have to be careful that you're using the right story, because if the person on the other end doesn't like the person in your story, your whole message falls apart. So you need to have a number of different stories. Or if they can't relate to the person in your story that you're trying to tell, you can lose people. So, I mean, we always, in my business, always say, yeah, let's put the human face on it. Let's put the human face on it. But you want to make sure that it's really something that will connect with your audience. So messages are relevant, they're concise, they're memorable, they're credible, and they're actionable. So here are some examples of some campaigns that have been very effective. We all know Change We Can Believe In. Very powerful, very simple, and people could see themselves in that. Okay, that's the other thing that's really important about that. Dove's Campaign for Real Beauty. Now, I took a commercial example, but that was a really powerful advertising campaign because it was about empowering and celebrating women, no matter whether you're, big, small, short, tall. It was about the beauty of women, and it really resonated in the way, and then they got, the way they got ordinary women to talk about themselves and to show them in a positive light. And they had multiple stories. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Race for the Cure. Okay, that started off as something, very, very small indeed 30 years ago, and it's, just this huge multi-million-dollar operation now. And, just listening this morning, I was watching the news, and, we can do something. I can take control is the message of their 3-day walk. So, again, people can see themselves in it, people can be involved. You always want to give some sort of concrete action. That's really important, and it's often what's missing from a lot of messaging from cause-related messages. Are there some questions before we move into another direction? Any questions or comments or thoughts? Because I've been talking a long time. Yeah?
First of all, thank you. You mentioned as a reporter that you don't want to be the person writing about the animal crackers, and it's, it was a good example, but it's oftentimes I feel like when we're talking about issues, particularly about issues by race, it's almost always the animal cracker story. How do we make it one that's relevant?
Okay. Well, that's interesting. And let me clarify. What I was referring to is that I was covering police and courts, and I literally got a press release from the animal cracker people that they were having a 100th anniversary. And I was like, hello? Anyway, well, it's really hard because actually your stories about race and wealth are really permeate almost every conversation. And I think what you have to do is really look at how you can, there isn't necessarily someone, at the larger places there are people who may have that beat, but there isn't a beat like that usually. So you're going to have to look at local reporters who cover, there may be people who cover housing, or there may be people who cover just general assignment. And you kind of have to start looking at what they're covering and say, hey, you wrote last week about, about this, I'm trying to think of a good example, about a family that, didn't have enough to eat, let's just say. Well, I want to give you another twist on that story. There are ways that here are some things that are, the reason that family doesn't have enough to eat is that they don't have a job, and they don't, so you kind of have to keep inserting, or, you could take some of the information that you have and package it up into, a report, and say, we've taken a look at families in our area and identified these 3 things, and they kind of go, yeah. But you just have to keep doing that and kind of reminding them, here's another angle on what you just covered. Here's another way to think about these issues, or these issues don't occur in a vacuum. And if you can get the reporter to sit down for 10 minutes for coffee, and try and connect your issues to the things that they're covering. That's kind of how you have to do it. I mean, if you just keep coming straight at them with cover it this way, but cover it from the perspective of, here's another way you could have amplified the story that you just did. I don't know if that's helpful, but I always appreciated that, actually, when someone would say, well, you didn't tell. Best thing to do is tell a reporter, you're not telling the whole story, or you're missing something. Here's what you're missing. And then they kind of say, they kind of poo-poo it, or I'm not really that interested. But then they may have another story down the road, and they're looking for a twist, or they may remember that, and you just have to, you can't give up after 1 or 2 tries. You have to really be relentless with it and just keep a steady drumbeat. Yeah.
My question is sort of, I guess, about how an organization would train itself, because normally we would have like one person that we designate to do media, or maybe a committee. But from what you said, it sounds like we all need to know this stuff. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we all need to be sitting down working on it. So maybe I answered my own question, but I want you to talk about sort of what's the strategy within an organization. I mean, I know we still should specialize, but somehow there's got to be some
and I think that's
knowledge.
It's a great question, because everybody says the communications person, whoever that is, well, we got it handled because they're doing communications. Well, the communications person really should be facilitating communications, but the executive director, your board, everybody needs to be engaged, because you don't have, most likely, the resources. Everybody has to be an ambassador. I like to say an evangelist for what it is that you are trying to communicate. And everybody has to be on the same page and aligned and understand the messages. So that, so it is important as part of that internal review that the key people in your organization, maybe it's once or twice a year, you come together and you take a look at, well, what are the messages that we've been sending? Okay, are they resonating? Are we being successful? Well, what should we be talking about? And now a communications person could facilitate some of those discussions, but ultimately I believe that your executive director is the chief spokesperson, or should be. And so you can't, one should not delegate that only to the communications people, because you're out in meetings all the time. And if you know, you're out, you're in coalitions, you may be at a meeting and there's a city council member there. You know, you may be at a dinner, you know, and that's an opportunity for you to engage that city council person. But if you're not, if you don't have a sense of your messages and you can't deliver them, you know, we talk about the elevator pitch, which, you know, is saying what you need to say in the 10 to, depending on how big your building is, how much time you have to get from where you're going to the bottom floor. If you can't do that in a way, and everybody in your organization can't do that, that's a problem. So, you know, everybody needs to be able to recite the elevator pitch, and the thing about the elevator pitch is people tend to want to, it's like a Christmas tree that they put so many ornaments on that you know, they have to get everything. We have this program, we have that program, and we do this and we do that. What you want to do with an elevator pitch is get someone to say to you, tell me more. Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. So, yeah, we build places that people want to, where people love to be. Really? Well, how do you do that? Well, I take this approach, and, you know, or here's an example of that. So everybody has to be on that same page, and I think it's really good to bring people to a room. And we're going to do an exercise in a minute where I'm going to ask you to sort of pretend to be your internal team and think about the way that you would approach, you know, the messaging based on some of the things that you've just heard this morning. Yes. Oh.
I think that many of us are in the South and Alabama, Texas, places like that, where we're trying to fight against some pretty powerful frames around, you know, the poor is lazy or handouts. And I wonder if you have any just sort of advice or anything that speaks to that about how to get out of those frames a little bit. And it may be that may be too general, but if you have any sort of suggestions on that off the top of your head. Well,
the first thing is not to repeat the frame. Right? No, the poor are not lazy. But, you know, and people do that because, you know, and so you have to recognize that there is the frame and that someone's coming at you with a frame. So, and again, you have to think carefully, well, okay, if that's the frame, these same folks, what are sort of their general feelings about other things? So, you know, if there's a sense of hard work, you know, fairness, the American, you know, what are the American values of work? And then you can demonstrate, and then you reframe it and say, you know, there are millions of there's in our city, there's hundreds of hardworking people who can't afford whatever, or who can't do whatever, and we're trying to help those hard-working people. Again, so that's a word. Listen to the way that those people who are framing, what are the words that they're using? Are they talking about hard-working people? Are they talking about American values? Are they talking about, then you want to co-opt some of that and use that to your advantage. I just heard something. I was watching Morning Joe this morning, and they were talking about Paul Krugman has an op-ed in the paper today about the millions, you know, the people who are no longer seeking unemployment. And it was very interesting to have Pat Buchanan and some other of the conservative folks on the program talking about how this was now a threat to capitalism. Okay? So now it wasn't that these people who were unemployed were lazy, but having this many unemployed people and an erosion of the middle class is a threat to capitalism. Boy, is that a powerful frame, right? So if you can show how this is a threat to capitalism, right, which is, you know, what are the things that these folks hold dear, right? That's where you want to go. But in order to do that, you have to take the time. And everybody always tells me, and I know I've worked in nonprofits. I've been a communications person in nonprofit organizations. You're being pulled in a million different directions. You're putting out fires all the time, you know. But you have to find the time somewhere to do this kind of thinking. You know, whether you pull people together for a day or something. Because in the end, if you do this, it will pay off for you big time. Otherwise, you just keep perpetuating what you're doing, which may not be getting you where you want to go. Does that help answer your... And there was a question over here? Oh.
Well, my question is similar to the one that was just asked. So at times, I feel like data presented without a historical context can be used to support a number of different causes.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that people are often resistant to hearing about or learning about issues such as redlining and its impact on wealth accumulation in the African American community. So in your experience, how do you frame your message so that it doesn't become watered down in the process?
Okay, so let's... So there were a couple parts. So one thing you were saying, so you were talking about redlining, and that the issue for you is that people don't want to hear it, or you think it's... Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you could talk about, and that's really hard because you have to find a way, you know, it's sort of, I mean, I might start thinking about it from the perspective of, you know, this threat to capitalism thing is on my mind, but you know, the American dream, everybody dreams the American dream, okay, whatever the American. And, you know, everybody should have an equal shot at that dream. And if there are systemic things that prevent people from doing that, it's like throwing someone in a pool saying, swim, but I got your hands tied. You know, or I've got, you know, or I put weights on you. So how can they, and then somebody else, you know, can get to that finish line a lot quicker. Well, that's what's happening with, this is where we talk about metaphor, right, in messaging. So if you were to say, well, you know, we've had a long tradition of redlining, okay, everybody sort of snooze, 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 just doesn't, you know, it doesn't resonate. But if you start painting a picture for people, well, now imagine, Senator, that you were trying to do X, Y, and Z, and imagine, Senator, that you didn't have, you know, you're trying, use the swimming, you know, you're trying to swim, you know, get into the Olympics or whatever. And then imagine that your teammate, you know, has the Speedo suit on that reduces draft, and I got weights on. Oh, well, I don't even have a chance. Well, Mr. Senator, that is what's happening. Okay, so it's sort of looking at how to, you know, cast that in a way that, when I'm telling a story and I'm painting a picture for someone, I'm not saying that necessarily would work, but it's you know, it's even the words that you use and getting people to see why that is harmful. The word redlining, you know, doesn't really convey you want to create an emotional, like, oh man, that's wrong. That is, yeah, I can see that. Now, whether they feel that that's wrong or not, but that's one way to start thinking about it. And again, what a lot of nonprofits, and I think nonprofits are, well, business people do this too, but there's so much jargon that gets used. You know, instead of, there's a guy, Andy Goodman, who does this whole thing on storytelling, and he said, you know, if a nonprofit were describing the Wizard of Oz, he would talk about Dorothy, a child who was in the foster system, who had a lost, unidentified animal, was a truant, and instead of saying, so using all this technical language, it takes the emotion out of it, and makes it hard for people to connect with it. When you think about, if you also think about what you're doing from a perspective of storytelling, and I don't mean that in the sense of just finding a compelling messenger, but really looking at what makes for a good story. Well, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's a hero and a villain, right? So you want to, and those are the sort of archetypes that there's a good guy and a bad guy, You're the good guys. Why are you the good guys? What's the bad? Is it the system? The system could be the bad guy. Redlining could be the bad guy. Whatever, but putting it in that context and then finding ways to tell that story. How do you help the hero? And
one of the things I think that we've been trying to do with some frustration, because I can't find the information, and I need to raise this with Avis, who did the presentation yesterday, is we've been trying to find ways to figure out the costs associated with continued inequality. So you can go to people in education, you can go to people in housing who are on legislative committees to deal with those issues. You can say, this is what's costing you. This is what's costing the state of Florida, the citizens of the state of Florida, if you don't take this action. So would you rather pay these costs, continue to pay them, or would you rather deal with this issue and minimize the costs down the road and correct the problem? So it's a frustrating thing because there's so much complexity involved in these issues. And I think for a lot of us, I speak for myself, congealing a very complex message down to a legislative one-pager, because everybody knows that laws are made from people who only read one page at a time. They don't want to look at 30-page reports. They don't want to look at research. Our recommendation in our group yesterday was we don't need to do any more research. What we need to do is reframe the research findings that have already been provided to us.
So I come out of an environment where we use a lot of our own jargon, and we have these buzzwords such as empowerment, stakeholders, and engagement. And I want to know, are there any buzzwords that we should stay away from that would actually kill our messaging in the beginning?
No. I think what you want to do, rather than focus on what words you shouldn't use, focus on words and phrases that help paint pictures, that create urgency, and help people understand what you're doing. So, if you're talking about empowerment, don't just stop there. Talk about what empowerment looks like and what the benefits of empowerment are, not just to the people who are empowered, but to the legislator or to other folks, to other parts of the constituents and I know policy is on your mind, which is why I'm talking about policy. Are there any? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. You finally convinced me that communication matters and that framing matters for positive outcomes. And I've seen the resources allocated by some large pharmaceutical company to one person to make a statement about their product, and they had many people with skills like you that would come in with a script, and then they would actually tape record it, and they would go back, and there would be feedback back and forth between them until they got to the point where the message was clear and the points were hit. The question is, an organization, should they, at the beginning, allocate a substantial portion of their budget to this sort of issue? Because I think you're not inexpensive.
No. Well, okay, so there's a couple of things. I do a lot of work with not-for-profits, and I'm a big believer in, helping the organization get to the point that they can do it themselves. Because if you always have to have, I mean, you can always use support and resources, but really you want to create organizations that are communications organizations, that you're always thinking about that, because it's the old, if the tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, did it really fall? Does it matter? And you have to be able to, budget cycles, funding cycles, you get money, then you don't have money, but you've always got to have a way to be able to communicate with people and tell your story. And that's why I say your board members all have to be activated and mobilized. Everybody who's associated with your organization is an ambassador. And I use the word evangelist. You should be out there preaching about what your issue is. So you may want to allocate some dollars to help you build that infrastructure and building off of what you have. Not just, oh, well, you need to hire all these people. Well, you may not be able to do that. So what are you going to be able to do with what you have? And really thinking that through. And that may mean, thinking about the jobs that people are doing now and how much time, making sure that that's important in your organization, that there is time that everyone be focused on, well, how are you going to communicate that? And are we doing that in the best possible way? People tend to think about communications when there is a problem, okay? When there's a reporter that's investigating you, or, and reporters are not out to get you, they're just out to get a really good story. And a really good story has controversy. And if you happen to be, controversial, then, or they think you are, that's what they're going to go for. The one thing I will say for all of your organizations is that you have an advantage because journalists tend to look at nonprofit organizations as the good guys. A lot of times I tell organizations that I'm working with, yeah, I could put this release out for you, but it's better if you do it, okay? Because I'm the hired gun, but it's much better if it comes from you, and that it doesn't look quite so buttoned up, that it's not so smooth and corporate, because that's what gives you credibility. And reporters, if they do have a bias, reporters love the underdog, right? And a lot of journalists who go into it really do go into it with a sense of wanting to tell the truth, wanting to, make sure that bad things are uncovered, And there's still a lot of people who do that, and I see this younger generation of journalists. A lot of them don't necessarily have the same rigor and craft, but many have they still have the passion. I mean, I'm amazed all the time about what I'm finding less of is that they don't really know what they should ask you. So all the more reason that your messages are really tight, because increasingly what I'm seeing with interviews is, you get the interview and they say, so tell me about your issue. And that throws, everybody thinks they're going to get, Mike Wallace, and it's going to be 60 minutes, and it's worse, because they don't know what they want to ask. And sometimes they come in with the frame that, you're wrong or they're right or whatever, but most of the time they don't know. So if you're not prepared to say, well, let me tell you about my issue, and you tell them what the important points are. If you'll notice, I kept saying throughout, if you leave here with nothing else, I was reminding you of the point that I wanted you to walk away with. And those are cues to people. Okay, I got to listen. If you take, the most important thing I can tell you is, okay, I got to listen. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's important to allocate dollars and time. What nonprofits have is they don't have time. But what I find is when being approached, you know, and they say, well, we got a grant to do communications. And I'll say, yes, but have you thought through how much time this is going to take within your organization to do this and what you're not going to do in order to do this?
So you're part of a dying breed, right? We have
Oh,
more and more trouble finding reporters to do these stories.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, where there was 10, now there's 3.
Right?
Well, I guess the question is, where are we searching for them? And are you recommending, well, where else do we find storytellers to help us with this stuff? And are you recommending that we start looking at creating our own media?
Mm-hmm. You know, you really ought to look at social media. And you don't necessarily have to have your own blog, right? Because that's very time intensive. But, you know, identify people who are influential bloggers and post on their blogs. It's a way for you to get your message out. But that requires, just like in the old days, I would read 5 or 6 newspapers a day. Now I skim 40 blogs a day across different, you know, industries and sectors to understand what the conversation is about the various issues that clients are dealing with. If you're going to have a Facebook page, you have to remember that the social media is a participatory medium. So just putting a Facebook page or opening a Twitter account, that's a first step. But unless you're going to really post on it and update people on it, don't do it. There's nothing worse than a page that you go to and there's been nothing on it for 6 months. And you know, Twitter is, the life of a tweet is, you know, about a half an hour. So it's something you got, you know, you don't have to tweet every 10 seconds, I'm going to this meeting, or I'm having lunch now, or, you know, which I think people think is what Twitter is about. I use Twitter, I love Twitter, and I don't tweet every day. I don't have time. But what I tweet when I have something to say, and I use it as a news feed. So I follow people. So you might want to start following your legislature. Most of these guys, most of the people have Facebook pages and Twitter pages, and it's or Twitter feeds, and it's a great way to get a sense of what they're thinking real time, right? And then how you might insert yourself, and it may give you ideas for stories to pitch. The other thing that you can do with Twitter is you link to other things. So you link to news stories, maybe even in other markets, you know, about your particular issue. And you build, you know, if you build a follower, I mean, I follow people because I know that they're going to tell me about something and keep me informed about something, you know, and that they're having interesting conversations. So what I'd like to do is pretend that we are in the town of New Welthia. And there's a legislative session coming up, and we have a very successful, you know, IDA savings program, and that is in danger of being eliminated. So you're the strategy team that is going to be preparing the messaging and the arguments to go before the legislature. So I don't necessarily want you to think you could, what your messages might be, but what would be some of the things that what would be a way for you to begin to organize that process? What are the things that you would need to think about and in order for you to start crafting that message? So when you talked in the beginning about how you would understand what the legislator, what was important to them, how did you talk at all about how you might come to that understanding of what mattered to the legislator? There wasn't enough time. I was just curious.
Yeah, we did talk about that, and that was one of our research projects, though, that we're having in Mississippi, is to take a look at our legislators, not only their voting rights, but who they are as a person and how they think.
Great.
And that's a concern to us too, because sometimes you have these formats, these booklets that you get from the state legislature, and it talks about where they went to school and how many kids they have and that they are married and that they did vote this way, but then there is something else that's a little deeper that we want to know about them. Do they own or pay their lending place in our community? And if so, we want to know that before we attack them.
Right, there you go. That's great. Good job. That's excellent. Good job. Who else?
Once we were told about the New Wealthy again, and we named our pseudo-legislator from Nancy Pelosi to Fancy Chelosi. And so we were trying to frame it to talk to that person directly. And so from there, we went through a number of thought processes about how poor people shouldn't be victimized for being poor. We need to incentivize savings. Most people have been devastated by the economy. We looked at past savings rates, how in the past, people of color had higher savings rates than they do today. We wanted to try to come up with some message to maintain or restore the savings rate as it was, say, 20 years ago. And we also came through the thought processes about supporting the family, supporting low-income people with savings, and looking at sustainability. So in the end, what our message would be to the legislator would be that our constituency that we're speaking for is a low-income population. We realize that they must save to maintain competitiveness, especially competitiveness with other groups, and therefore we want to focus on family and sustainability.
Framing this from the family values, okay? This is something that is out there all the time, and if you can demonstrate that this is about supporting families. And, you know, so, because people, you know, tend to go to, unless they're really passionate about savings, when you talk about the savings as a way to support families, and then our family value should be that we help families do these kinds of things, and then you can go back into the money issue. And when we support families, those families become taxpayers. And then when they're taxpayers, they're contributing to society. So when you say, somebody asked about what words don't use or whatever, being productive citizens. That's a word, that's a phrase that gets used a lot, but what does it really mean? Well, a productive citizen pays taxes. If that's what matters to you, you know, so you want to, you know, co-opt the frames that are out there and make them yours. Mm-hmm.
So the current conversation is that, you know, the poor are not very literate when it comes to financial means, and, you know, they don't know how to do things such as manage a checkbook, et cetera. So we basically said that programs like this provide financial literacy, and they provide sustainable growth for not only the African American community, but if that growth is sustained, it could, you know, increase the per capita GDP of the U.S. as a whole. So, you know, in the long run. We also said that it provides confidence for the individuals to know that they can reach certain financial goals. And we also said that it's an alternative for more expensive options that may be put into place by the government.
Mm-hmm. So. There are some really good messages here about saving money, supporting families, creating taxpayers, adding to the tax base. I mean, these are all really powerful messages that, you know, if you can frame the issue, you know, are compelling.
One of my concerns with our messaging, while it may convince policymakers to reauthorize IDAs, it also may perpetuate a negative perception of the community that we're trying to impact. And that is that the problem resides in the individual, that there's something that the individuals are doing wrong or don't have enough information about, or when in fact, low wealth is a result of policies that have fostered the accumulation of wealth for higher income folks, but not for lower income folks. And so how do we incorporate in our message a correction in terms of the the frame that people already have in their minds.
Well, so when we talked about heroes and villains, the villain can be the systemic, okay, and I wouldn't use the word, but can be the policies and things that make it unfair, that make it difficult for people who are trying, who are working hard. I mean, you want to use words like hardworking Americans. So part of the thing you want to reframe is that you're talking about people who, many of the working poor, people who just, they're working 3 and 4 jobs, and maybe that's where you have to start, and so if the frame is that these people are, lazy and not working hard, or that the problem is within them, you want to start talking about the unfairness in the system that makes it hard for hardworking Americans to make it, and so the system, and you're making a really good point, because one of the things that you want to do with the framing is show it in a larger context, that it isn't just about this person or this person or this person, but it is a systemic issue that is making it hard for people to move up the economic ladder, as it were. So but it sort of goes back to the question you had about redlining, right? So again, and that's a longer, what you're talking about is a longer, this frame has been around for a long, long time, and it's going to be hard to move people, but you have to just keep showing that and painting, painting folks as these are hard-working Americans. These are people who are, whatever jobs they're doing. You paint a picture for the folks, and that, how can someone move up when there's so many barriers in the way and we can take those barriers away, Mr. Legislator. We can make it possible for these hardworking Americans. We can support these families. And so even just the words that you use in the way that you're talking about the population, not as victims, but as people who are really trying to achieve the American dream, and they're having a hard time because the deck is stacked against them. And because there is, one of the things is there is a very strong American value about fairness, that everyone should have that opportunity, whether people truly believe it or not. That's a frame in our society. And that's what makes us different from some of the European countries where it's, where the systems are so much more rigid. And there is that belief that if you work hard, you're gonna get there, but not if the system is stacked against you.
I think we also have to be aware that our language is often preempted. It's taken away and used in the opposite. So we may think we come up with great expressions, and yet conservatives can actually take that, twist it around, and use it. The ownership society is a big example of that. That was started out by the asset building movement, and it was preempted to be a bigger cause for everyone. Why don't we all have an ownership society, not just part of the, and that's the other thing. I think a lot of times legislators fear that there'll be a backlash, just like with affirmative action. That's a nice phrase, affirmative action. It's very positive, and yet that was flipped because it's like, well, you have affirmative action, but we don't have affirmative. We want big affirmative action for everyone. So the language will sometimes get taken away, and it will be used for like the larger cause, and then we're put right back down on the ladder again.
But that's because we let them take it away, right? I mean, that's the thing. I think sometimes what happens on, the more progressive side of things is that the argument is cerebral and not in the gut. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Language is incredibly important. And the conservative, that's why you should read Frank Luntz, okay? Because he's a mastermind of a lot of those very successful campaigns, and they're really good at it, and they're disciplined, and they just stay focused on it. And so it's a question of don't let them take it away. So we are at 10:30. So I guess our time is up.